Eric, my
Nice.
one request though is if you could get a white T-shirt so we could be Backstreet Boys for Halloween.
Oh yeah, let me grab one real quick.
Do you have any like clear rimmed glasses by any chance, Eric? That would really help the look.
He doesn't have his head anymore. He can't hear.
Fuck.
Let's start with utility. I don't understand what it even means.
Everybody has some kind of utils in their head that they're calibrating.
There's hardly anything that hasn't been used for money.
In fact, there may be a fundamental problem in modeling what I want to model.
Game Economist Cast, episode 33. We're here, we're on schedule, and we've got a +1. The one we've been trying to get on the cast forever. He's foiled my requests up until now, and he's finally here. Jason Arentz, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. Arentz.
Actually,
okay, thank
I
you.
don't know. You guys who live in
Dr.
Scandinavia
Arentz.
can maybe tell me. We've had disagreements across my family for a generation now. Maybe it's Arentz, maybe it's Arentz.
Ooh,
I'm
there we
not
go.
totally sure. I don't know.
That one.
I think we have like history in both Germany and Norway, Sweden. So maybe y'all can do some research for me.
You're American now. It's pronounced however you want to pronounce it.
Yeah, so Arentz.
It's been like, you think it's been like 6 years when I first found you trying to collect the
I don't know if it's
Avengers?
been 6 years. It's been a few years though. You're right. It has been a while. Let's chalk this up to one of the other upsides about layoffs is I suddenly have some time when I can talk.
I love how we made like the opportunity cost docket. Like we are opportunity cost. Finally, we like moved up our ranked list.
That's the thing about, I don't know, the games industry. I feel it's a lot of fun. I love being in it. It's not permanent crunch time. It's really hard to find space where you have also energy and attention to like really be able to do side things. So I just have had 0 side hustles. And also I've got a kid. So I think that if I didn't have a daughter, that might also make a big difference.
You used to be an academic, so it's probably like the opposite of academia, where like in academia, you have these very strict semesters. When the semester is done, you finally have some time to do this stuff that you've been sitting on forever. It's not like that in the games industry.
That is true. That is true. It is the opposite. I also find it more satisfying though. I found academia to be pretty soul crushing. Personally, I think all the incentive structures were wrong, and I respond to incentives too much. So I had to get out.
Tell us about your background in academia and what's wrong with the incentive structures.
My name is Jason Arentz, and I'm a economist. It's great to meet you guys. I have a weird path into gaming industry. First of all, my undergraduate was actually in physics, so that's weirdly.
Thanks for the literacy. Maybe economics is like physics.
Maybe
You flatter us.
Yeah, well, I find that physics is weirdly the unifying piece of my whole story because when I was in high school, I knew I wanted to study physics because it's so silly. I specifically, I wanted to know the language in which the poetry of the universe was written. It was very specific. That was the like highfalutin goal of it all. And then after I got my undergrad in physics, I realized I love it as a consumer, but as a producer, like I just balancing mirrors or like adjusting mirrors on like slates that are floating on Mercury in like a basement, like just not fun. I actually love people a lot more than I loved electrons. I wanted to make my life's work about people somehow. So I started hunting around for what other things I should go study or like other directions I should go in. Played with a few things. Interestingly though, the big moment for me to bring me into economics was we used to have this Conference of World Affairs thing at CU Boulder, and Deirdre McCloskey came and gave a lecture. Anyway, she was amazing. So like Auntie Deirdre was like my introduction to economics, like directly.
Wow.
And I talked to her afterwards.
Do you remember what it was about?
Yeah, this was in her, I forget like which of the bourgeois virtue, bourgeois dignity like stage she was in. She was on the lecture circuit like in preparation for that magnum opus. And it was so fascinating. And she was really generous with her time. I talked to her after the lecture and I was like, I'm a physics background, but what you're doing is amazing. Where should I go? And it was actually by her recommendation. She said, if you've got the math chops and you've got the scientific background, you might want to consider experimental economics at George Mason University. And I was like, I will just take your advice, having no idea what you just said. And I went to George Mason and absolutely loved it. Got into the experimental program with Vernon Smith there, met my wife there. It was like the single best sentence of advice I've ever taken. And that's what brought me into economics, was like through that program.
Did you even know what you were signing up for with Mason?
No.
And like what the Mason
Not
brand
at
is,
all.
like the history,
Nope.
the pedigree?
No
Interesting.
idea. No
Vernon
idea.
Smith's not a bad thing if you only knew that though.
Yeah.
Oh shit, they have the Nobel Prize and basically the person who put this on the map.
Was Vernon Smith your advisor, or he was just at the university?
He
at the
wasn't
same
my
time?
direct advisor, but he was very hands-on with everybody who was in the experimental program.
That's
So
insane.
I took classes classes with him, and we did grad school paper presentations to one another, and he was in the room giving advice. Like, he
Wow.
was that guy is amazing. I want that much energy
Yeah.
when I'm 90. He
started the experimental program at Purdue. I'm sure you know this.
Did
This
he go to UVA
after
too?
having studied.
Fuck.
He may have been there, but
Buchanan went
he
to UVA.
started his first experiment was at Purdue, and then I think probably in the 90s left or something like that. So by the time I got there, it was like he had been gone for many years. But that's incredible. That's so funny because Deirdre McCloskey also had an impact on
Yeah?
me pre-grad school, and Vernon Smith was like a prominent figure at the grad school that I ended up going to. So I met McCloskey at a history of economics
Yes.
conference in Chicago.
Yeah.
And I was actually I think I was checking people in. I was just like a grad student who they were like, we'll give you $100
Yeah.
in a room if you come do this conference. I was chatting with her and I just went up to her really awkward. I was like, hey, I'm a huge fan. I just wanted to let you know it's really cool to meet you. And she just had like such positive, encouraging things
Right?
to say. She was like, it was incredible. I was like, yeah, I'm going to Purdue. I was like, I know it's not like MIT or anything. She was like, oh, Purdue used to be the #1 program. It was just like this incredible positivity. It made me really feel good about the prospect of going to grad school.
Totally.
It gave me the confidence that I needed.
While I was
Really
at George Mason, within the experimental lab, like you like various grad student duties or whatever. And one of the ones that nobody else wanted that I signed up for was managing the lecture series. And so when we had her come out to give some talk, and there's also some overlap between the experimental group and like the Mercatus Center. It's one of the advantages of George Mason. It's just a huge program, and like people aren't precious about those kinds of resources. She actually came out a couple times, but once, I got to meet her at the airport. Like, I was like, yeah, I'll be the taxi. Absolutely.
You trap her. You could trap her for 30 minutes in a car ride where she has to talk to you.
Exactly. I'm fantastic, right? Who would miss out on that opportunity? Went out to dinner and stuff too. So it was fun to be in, I don't remember, I think my 3rd year or something like that, and said, hey, I took your advice and thank you for that advice. And now I can talk to you in a more serious way, having actually read your stuff and knowing what's going on in the world. Yeah, it was amazing.
So where did it all go wrong?
It nowhere went wrong. I'm very
no. Can you tell us about your dissertation a little bit? So experimental econ, probably popping around then. When does Vernon Smith get his Nobel Prize? What was that? Somewhere in the 90s?
It was before. He got his Nobel Prize in 2001.
Oh, it was much later than I thought. Actually, I know it was late 90s. Okay, so stuff's really popping. Stuff's really popping.
I was there in 5, 6. Yeah, it was popping. So my dissertation was experimental methodologies, but in political economy. I had a chapter on case study comparison between Mao Zedong and Joseph Stalin. I did a laboratory on Bruce Benedict theory. So I created a little laboratory environment where like you either needed a majority to maintain your dictatorship or you needed like a smaller minority to maintain your dictatorship. Right? So selectorate like ratio to the overall population, where like the main choice that the dictator makes is how much to tax and then like how much to spend on public goods and how much to like just take and hand off to your winning coalition. And it was fun. It was very interesting. It's very easy to turn undergraduates into dictators, it turns out. And it's also fascinating how quickly the winning coalition figures out the game too. I did have a couple instances where students tried to be benevolent dictators and I'm just going to maximize the global. They were immediately executed. The coalition was like, I bet we could find somebody who's more corrupt who would take care of us better. It was immediate. Yeah. And one of my students came to me and was like, wow, I guess I'd make a good mafia boss. I'm like, maybe I'm not doing good things in the world.
So how do you move the equilibrium? So I immediately think of like kind of the second world countries that have fallen into these like communist dictator states. They like just hang around South America. Can you do anything with this? Does this tell us anything about like getting outside that equilibrium?
Bruce Mosquito's like perspective on that would be it's largely an institutional story and you've got to build out of that institution so that isn't a small group of people who have that control. When you look in the like actual populace, that small group of people is usually like the generals of the whatever corrupt military groups and whatnot. So how do you to not have that power anymore? I don't really know. It's a tough question. But yeah, he would say that this is the benefits of like more democratic institutions, but only if they're actually constitutionally constrained, because otherwise you end up in this terrible situation where you get like a hypothetically democratic scenario with a rigged system so that everybody then has an incentive to pretend as if they support the existing dictator, which he would say is like a Putin kind of arrangement. So yeah, it's a tough problem. That was originally what I thought I might go do though, is like try to help on those problems and try that stuff out. Boy, is it messy and boy, is it like thankless work. And I didn't find a lot of like hope there, honestly. But I also saw a lot of people who had good intentions, went to try stuff, and then went and made everything worse. So I was very nervous about that. And I thought maybe I'll go get some real world wisdom before I start like really pushing specific policies.
You ever read
internationally.
Easterly's
Yeah.
Adventures and Misadventures in the Tropics?
Yeah, fascinating stuff, right?
That one had a big effect on me personally.
Yeah. The like whole like Easterly versus Sachs, like all of that stuff, and in contemporary, Asimov and Johnson and Power and so on. Like, there's just like there's so many different perspectives in there. It's a lot to really wrap your head around if you're going to go and try to do something practical in the world. I think if you're just like writing equations on whiteboards and like writing papers is not too bad, but I've always wanted to be a little bit more in the field than that. You know, the economists I've always admired the most were like Adam Smith in a pin factory and like Coase, like actually in there talking to actual firms and doing work in the space. And that's part of why I think I always was never really comfortable just in the academy.
So you do take a professorship after Mason.
Yes.
You
so
do.
So like I said, my wife and I met in grad school. She graduated before me. She already had her master's when she went into the program, so she had a bit of a head start, but she's also just smarter than I am. So she finishes a little bit ahead of me. And she did originally want to take the academic track, and she did the whole classic job market story and went and got a position that had a good laboratory and good funding for her so she could continue doing experimental work. And then when I graduated, I at first just followed her because I was a little bit undecided about what I wanted to do. But my first move was to go into business intelligence analysis with a transportation company. The position she got was in Arkansas, which is a place I didn't expect that I would ever live, where I had more culture shock than I did when I lived in Taiwan, but was great in its own way. Northwest Arkansas in particular, Fayetteville, it's like proto Austin, Texas. Like the music scene there is bumping. There's a great art museum. It's a cool area, actually. I do recommend it. But anyway, so I followed her out there and went into the transportation industry and suddenly became like aware of this thing called supply chain management, which is applied economics the same way that like finance is applied economics, and learned a lot about how products move and what damaging it is to be late and how hard it is to know whether or not somebody's been late. Like started learning about telemetry, started learning about how data is used and how it is often misused in contract negotiations and so on. It was a great crash course. But the supply chain management department there, I formed some friendships and relationships there. And then like we could really use a token economist in our department, particularly to talk about like policy related things. So I ended up being like sucked back into the ivory tower for a little while, and so was a professor at University of Arkansas in Fayetteville. There for a while, also moved around. I taught in supply chain management. I also taught like quant and micro macro, a few others. I did on policy and supply chain management, which was super interesting. And that's where I was really leaning a lot on Milton Friedman. We watched a lot of his videos about like trucking industry and what unions did within the trucking industry, what deregulation looked like in that space. And that was really fun. You pulled in some Ayn Rand as well, which was also interesting, as you can totally describe Atlas Shrugged as a supply chain management story, so much so that you can actually map it out as a like supply chain management analysis experience. So that was a time, like I really enjoyed it. But what I enjoyed was the teaching, not the research. As like, you can't, like that's not, it's really hard to have a successful teaching career. And I just wasn't feeling it. I was like, I don't love this work. I don't want to be doing, I love teaching, but I don't love the research work that much. I was increasingly burning out. My wife was increasingly burning out. Both of us were just not liking the academic like world. This did not feel like it was incentive aligning us towards maximizing value creation, like for other people. That's like my summary of the incentive structures in academia. I personally started like meditating on what I would do with tenure, and I think it would be bad for me. I think tenure would make me an unhealthy person. Like I've met the professors that I think I would become if I had tenure.
Do you think the average marginal product of an industry economist is higher than the average marginal product of an academic
Orders
economist?
of magnitude for the average. Now there might,
Yeah.
I think in the very like upper slivers, there might be a few academic economists who are doing phenomenal work, but I think at the average, I think at the 75th percentile, it's orders of magnitude more productive. And I think we are doing a terrible disservice to the economy, to people's well-being in the general sense by strongly incentivizing all of these smart people to not be producing real value.
It's almost hard to incentivize economists to go into academia now. Most people, it's like, why would I go into academia? There's not really any return to being, unless you get tenure and you're at a prestigious university, but there's no kind of marginal benefit of being better.
Right.
It's like these big giant leaps that you make. That's all or nothing.
It was supposed to be about
that's
these
interesting.
positive externalities, right? That's what this was supposed to be when you produce research. But I do think there's something to like the Nobel Prize winning papers. Like I do think
There's something to
definitely
is
think
there
there's something to Vernon Smith. There's something to
Yes.
things that he ended up revealing. But I'd also say like in the private sector, there's also knowledge spillovers that happen pretty frequently. Like Hal at Google, I'm sure the shit he's done on second price auctions has made its way to Meta, has made its way to all these different
Right.
companies. And so that doesn't always get properly credited. I don't know.
What did he do
I
on second
agree.
price auctions?
He optimized a lot of the algorithms that Google ended up using after
Because
the
they
DoubleClick
switched back to
acquisition.
first price auctions.
Did they really?
Yeah, they did 3 years
I
ago.
thought they were using like a modified Wiki auction or some shit. I'm sure he's done a ton of work on their auction theory though. It would be shocking to me if he didn't, and he's been there for 20 years. So I think even the work he's done, like it does spread.
Yes.
That kind
It
of gets
definitely does.
underappreciated.
And it spreads in a lot of ways. I think one of the most underappreciated ways is that most people in tech have worked at a lot of different tech places. Like
Yep.
the knowledge transfer is quick, like the trade secrets and like the specific things that you're like not supposed to share from place to place, but like the day-to-day structures or like the management wisdom even, right? Like most of that, like it transfers rapidly. A lot of companies deliberately hire from people who have been at specific companies because they're trying to recreate that culture or like that workflow or something in that structure in their own environment. Yeah, it's huge. And I just think that it's tangible, it's specific, it's like actually making actual people's lives like higher productivity, lower prices, like better products, like more. I just, it's so strong. So yes, I agree. Like on the 1% level, right? Like maybe 1% of academic economists are doing something really amazing that is better than they could have done in industry. But every once in a while, you get one of those top economists who then goes into industry and it like explodes, right? Like just like does incredibly so. Like I don't know.
Does that bring us to
amazing.
Halo?
No, it does not. Anyway, that's my general feel on it. I am generally of the opinion that most economists should at least try going into business. And then if you want to retire back into the academy, then now you've got real things to talk about the same way that like Coase and Adam Smith had real things to talk about. And I just personally wish that was the model instead of the go in as a person who's never made anything and try to model what it means to make things. I just don't think it's the societal best structure.
Kind of second that. I feel like in industry, you have so much more data, so much more resources. Whereas as an academic, you're like trying to these public data sources or whatever. Whereas industry, you're like, oh, let's just run an experiment. Yeah, we've got millions of users, no problem.
And push. Even when I was really stressed out and trying to finish the 6th chapter in my dissertation, which was an absurd amount to write grade. But like when I was like stressed out about that too, right? I still wasn't as productive as I am now. Part because you're agonizing over the minutia of what some ass in the back row is going to be like, really? Did you consider? Like you're so wrapped up in it, it really slows you down, even when you're stressed out and working hard. Having a lot of that stripped away. We don't care about the 5th order effect. My God, make us money this month. It really transforms the way you work. And so like even hardworking people, I think, experience within themselves a productivity boost moving into industry.
Jason, talking about this industry versus academia, your primary field was in experimental economics, and I'm sure you've done experiments in industry since you've been in it.
More than I expect.
Oh, yeah, definitely. One thing that I noticed is, so I ran a few, experimental was my secondary field. I was mostly labor economics. So I ran a few experiments in the lab. And it just is a completely different experience compared to an industry where it's, okay, we've got 2 different UIs. It's super fast, completely different, like a completely different approach. For one, you're not fucking doing IRB. So I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
So my wife went Amazon and ad space. And so she's been doing experiments like all the time.
Yeah.
She also worked briefly in a transportation startup, but it was tech. And yeah, you're right. Exactly. It's UI stuff. And you're almost always in a situation where statistical significance is like the least of your concerns because you've got like a billion observations. It takes so long to process how much data you have. Make your algorithms good so it doesn't have to run all weekend. It's totally opposite. Right? So much of our training in experimental was you've only got 20 points. Can you discard anything or not with a rank sum test, right? I'm going to try to be tricky. Like none of that is relevant. The biggest tricky thing I feel in the game space, though, is that it is such a messy environment. It is very difficult to parse what is meaningful. And also, my God, if players don't talk to each other. Like in the lab, we would go out of our way to prevent communication between players. We have them in different rooms. We do have people monitoring to make sure nobody was like whispering to one another. And in the video game space, can you imagine having 2 different prices for like in-game goods? Like for like group A and group B? Like
Yeah.
they would know in 10 minutes, would be
They
all over
did.
Reddit,
There's a
and they
famous
would freak.
There's a famous
Is there?
Kotaku article. We can actually look this up right now, where Zynga price tested Fast
Oh
and
my God.
Furious 2 cars. One of the
See?
variants I think was 30, and I think the other one was 5. It was a high number. Don't quote me on that. We'll see if I can't link it
That
in
would
the
be a
show
huge
notes.
difference.
But that immediately was typed up on Kotaku. But
You're right.
I guess my question would be like, who gives a fuck? Who cares? Who cares if players talk? Amazon, to your point, they're testing prices every single day, every single minute, every single refresh. Airlines do this all the time. This is
Mhm.
so I've heard this criticism and I've never quite understood it. Is like, oh, it's the Hawthorne effect, like people will know they're being experimented with and it'll change the settings, or
If it's price, I think there's a legal concern.
What's your legal concern on it?
maybe in the
Like
EU.
if people are getting different prices, okay, yeah, maybe that's fair.
You're right, though.
That's what makes it tough to run experiments in our game, because there's like literal money attached to every single decision
Right.
player makes. If we hinder somebody's ability to make money, we've like effectively fucked with their wages, which is good.
I get that, but even legal aside, I think there's a strong brand impact that people have, and I think the damage you do to your brand makes it not worth it.
Why is it damaging though? Isn't it how you frame it? Someone got a lower price, right? This was the King experiment. Someone got a lower price, they didn't increase prices. Isn't that the hedge?
Yeah, well, we did that at Riot. There was a promotion. It's up for 2 weeks. You get random offers with different discounts on them. And
Yeah, that would be the way. I think that's the least bad way.
Yeah, you frame it as personalized. You frame it as a benefit, and then they don't complain. But
Did they not complain?
not much. We did some tricks to make it like anchor them to make them feel good. Like
Yeah.
everyone got one item at the best discount, and everyone got one item at the worst discount. So they all
Oh, that's smart.
the numbers
Okay.
looked similar, even if
Oh,
on the back end
interesting.
we were like, oh, this person's a high monetizer. Give them
Just
a
the
higher
weekly
price.
discount thing you would get. I forget what it was called. Did
No,
you
it's
get
like
that there?
Night Market in Valorant, if you've seen that.
Okay.
Anyway, but yeah, no, to your point though, it is difficult to give people different prices and not have them be upset.
Exactly. They follow it, they know. But the other issue, I think, is independence. You lose a lot of your argument of independence, so it makes your statistics a little bit more complicated.
But would we know the direction of the bias though? Could we think about what direction the bias would be?
I don't think it would be a broad stroke generalization. I
get-
think you'd have to really think through very carefully the specific instance.
But if you knew there was a
sensitive.
discount in another variant, you could withhold your spend now in anticipation of a future discount. Like it could be rolled out in the
Right.
future. So I guess
Right.
you could see an overestimation of the delta because your control group is potentially withholding spend, and maybe even your B group that's in the experiment knows it could end, so they might push their foot to the pedal. I don't know, maybe something like that. I'm just spitballing. Sorry, go ahead.
But even beyond pricing, like everything from
Basically
game
right.
balance to matchmaking, like there's all these spillover population level effects.
Yes, exactly.
But wait, Jason, tell us about what games you worked on.
Yeah, hold on. We gotta get to transition. We gotta get to the moment where where he's I'm gonna do games.
The moment when I realized I'm going to do games was actually, it grew over time. I was getting increasingly frustrated with the internal politics of the university. I was getting increasingly and it is politics. Like it's got that like duplicitousness where people will be friendly to your face and then like vote against you in a committee. And it was so like ugly and
Fights are
uncomfortable.
so fierce because the stakes are so petty, or
I was just about to say the stakes are so low. It's exactly it. That's exactly. I lived that, and it was horrible. And so LinkedIn posted an ad for a game economist at 343, and I was like, I can't not apply for that. And it was like very much like a far shot. I was like, I don't have the industry experience. How is this going to work? But I applied to a few other places too. But that it came through, and it just turned out that they were interested in. I think that they were largely inspired by like the Amazon, like we just hired some economists and magic happened, right? Microsoft has a central economics team that is largely research driven and works together with other teams, but they are doing big statistical analysis. But they hadn't really built out a lot of embedded economists. But 343 itself was large enough, I would argue too large, and had the resources at the time. They were building the slip space engine for Halo Infinite, and they're like, maybe we can do something special and different with, for example, Forge. Like that, most of the things I was originally hired for all got scoped out. Is there a place to transform a Forge-like thing into a Roblox-like thing? Probably not. That's not really what that's for, but should we explore it? They also wanted me to comment on things. I think that the leadership at the time had pretty much already decided that they didn't want to do loot boxes the way that Halo 5 had done loot boxes, but they're like, can we still make money if we don't do loot boxes? Or are we like constrained and bound to this? So I went in and did a bunch of theoretical analysis with them. I was also a liaison with the central Xbox, just data analytics team. I was one of the few people, I think, who was at 343, but like in constant meetings with other people throughout. Microsoft, which was super fun. Infinite was delayed, and then all of a sudden, like all hack time shenanigans like came to a grinding halt, and a lot of stuff got scoped out, right? Like when a game gets delayed by a year, it really changes like the experience dramatically. And so it was in the context of all of that I ended up shifting over to the publishing wing and got a much broader view of what, smaller titles, third-party titles wanting to publish through Xbox, what they go through, learned a lot more of the like finance side, started doing more financial forecasting, structuring it in such a way that you can make a pivot table on it and turn it into a balance sheet, which is really valuable. And it was actually in that context where I first encountered a game that we were working with, partnership, that the gap that they had was in product management. They needed strategy. They needed to be able to link from their vision to a roadmap to an actual product. And I just jumped on that opportunity because I've always enjoyed institution thinking, strategic thinking. Let's go for that. And it was awesome. And I fell in love with it. And it was like the thing that I enjoyed the most, like far and away. And so then I socially met Robert Bowling, who is one of the founders at Midnight Society and has a famed history in the game industry for quite a long time. And he told me about Dead Drop, and Dead Drop being a first-person shooter, but an extraction shooter with kind of a fun niche in extreme verticality, which it really does change the experience of the game dramatically. But where is it possible to make a game where you shoot somebody, take the thing out of their backpack, and now it's yours? And I was like, that sounds horrible. That sounds like a lot of problems could be in that. Like, how are you going to deal with this and this and this? And he was like, I don't know. How would you deal with that? I was like, let's figure. Well, I didn't actually say it. So they like hunted me down. They're like, we need you or somebody like you. Like, how would you actually do this stuff? And so they gave me an offer I couldn't refuse and pulled me out of publishing and into the startup world, which is fantastic. I really enjoyed the startup environment, and I have never, since I graduated, I've never used such a large percentage of my graduate training before. I was using my political econ to keep track of what the hell the SEC was doing. I was using all aspects of identifying opportunity costs, identifying trade-offs, like within teams. Like, what is your actual production function? What is a production function on like new geometry for a weapon? Like, how does that actually run? What are the upstream and downstream costs? So there's like supply chain management stories there as well, but they're complexity stories. And every person, like every new weapon that comes in has to be, even if you outsource it, it has to be integrated. And that's taking time away from an artist who could be making their own thing on their own, right? Like that is so fascinating. And I think that's one of the reasons why I advocate for Economist to try out product management, because you have to hunt those things down. Like you have to be an ethnographer. Like you have to like learn what everybody's doing and listen very carefully and have a pretty detailed understanding of all of the pieces so that you know which things to negotiate for and which ones to let slide. And it's been a lot of fun for me. So that was the thing I loved the most. And if it weren't for the vicissitudes of Web3 funding leading to a tragic, like 50% layoff, I would still be there. I loved it. So that's the tragic moment I'm in now, is like watching this thing I loved and a community I loved get away like that. Has been pretty painful.
I work in a very similar position, multifaceted job, do everything from data analytics to design.
Yeah.
I certainly have had my fair share of realizations. I've come to appreciate the industry in some ways, and I've come to not appreciate the industry in some ways. I'm curious. I have my own thoughts that I don't even necessarily share publicly about where I think the industry needs to go or where it is going. I'm affiliated with a company, so I have to be careful with my verbiage. But now that you're not affiliated, this on-chain concept, I think that's something that's certainly in the last 6 months to a year has been completely forgotten. Nobody gives a shit about it anymore. It feels like people are like, we'll just do a cryptocurrency and that'll be the game. Yeah. So I'm really curious, how important is that to you? For me, it's extremely important. Other people have different opinions. I'm curious to hear your.
I'm not married to any particular Web3 aspect. Our perspective at Midnight Society was always, let's make a great game. And if there are things that Web3 tech can improve on, can make more interesting or more cool, let's do it. And let's lean in hard. But it was never like the initial point for us in that space. And that's how I feel about it. Is if these are superior technologies, let those superior technologies win out in the marketplace.
Yeah.
Right. That's very much where I land. That having been said, let me give my personal pitch for why I think NFTs and video games are very interesting and why I really like it. This going to be my quick nod to Bart Wilson, who was at George Mason when I was a grad student there at Clemson University now. He and Vernon Smith have done a lot of great work together, but Bart has a book out called The Property Species, and it's a great deep dive into the evolutionary psychology and linguistic backgrounds of words such as property and how we emotionally connect with it, and where is the property, right? A bunch of the book is like, where is the property? What does that mean? I think that most players, seasoned players anyway, who have had the experience of playing a game, spending money on stuff, and then not having that stuff afterwards, have started to have a little bit of a detach in their minds about what it is that they're buying. And I do think that there is something, even though it might be somewhat ephemeral, about saying that I own this thing that is verified not just by this company, but like everybody agrees, right? The ledger tells me that this is my thing. And when I give it to somebody else, now it becomes their thing. When I sell it to somebody else, it now becomes their thing. That is powerful in a way that like a centralized trading market, whatever, wow, like that's all on a Web 2 space, that it misses. That is really powerful. Like interoperability is like a different challenge, and there's a lot of hurdles there, but even just for a game, if it is a game that has some staying power, that sense of ownership, I think biologically shifts the way we feel about the object. And that is very interesting to me.
You see it in public discourse all the time. It's really interesting because there is simultaneously, and it's paradoxical.
Yeah.
There's a paradox where hardcore gamers desire ownership so much. They miss the physical disc. They miss owning the console. They miss putting it in and reading through their manual, simultaneously and paradoxically saying that they fucking hate NFTs. And it's like, there's just this, you don't even understand that's what we're trying to do. Is we're trying to, what was the game? Steam. It was Steam. They recently updated their TOS, or maybe some disclaimer that was like, just so you know, you're buying a license. You're not buying the game. And I remember a whole bunch of people, certainly on Twitter, maybe on Reddit, getting upset about this. They're like, what the fuck? Of course I own it. And it's, guys, this is what we're trying to do. I know it doesn't seem like it's you because you hear the word NFT and you get angry, but we're trying to make it so that when you do purchase this thing, you do own it.
Yes.
And then anyway.
No, I totally agree with you. But
really,
let's continue on that for a minute, because I think it is very interesting. And I desperately wish that there hadn't been so many damn scams coming into it. One of my experiences was like, okay, I've never worked in a Web3 space before. Let me learn what the other games are doing. Oh my God.
There's no point. There's like no point in doing outside research,
there's no
because
point.
there's not
That's
really
exactly
anything out there. And the most successful products are not really Web3 that much anyway.
Right.
So it's not that helpful, and you're not able to do the correct types of analytics.
Right.
The most accessible other projects for us are things like Soul Casino, which is a gambling game.
Right.
Or what used to be on chain was a game called, I'm blanking on it. Phil, dang it. I'm sorry, I ruined your.
Give me some hints.
It's the horse one.
Horse?
The
Zen
horse.
Zen Run.
The horse.
Zen Run. Zed Run.
Zed Run. Zed Run, where it's Zed Run. You know, you're like, you've got this on-chain, again, mostly a gambling game. So there's not a lot of good reference material.
Right.
And the best reference material is Web 2 material that basically should be brought into the like 21st century. Your EVE Onlines that are now, with the release of Frontiers, doing Web 3. So yeah, I can't even imagine. When did you start working at Midnight Society?
What was that? 22, 21?
Okay.
I was there for 2 and a bit years, something like that. 2.5 years.
Yeah, certainly in the beginning, there was nothing. We've had a few breakout hits in the industry, and we'll probably get to the big one, the recent news, in a little bit.
Yeah, it's super fascinating.
All right.
And I think it's, so for me, to be honest, like in an interview, this would be like an example of product management through a big pivot and like incorporating customer feedback of a story. But the original vision of Dead Drop was literally every weapon that you get, however you got it, whether it's one that we dropped or you bought, like a thing on chain, it's in your backpack when you die. Anybody who picks up your backpack, that's theirs now. And it was really interesting that players were very nervous about that, extremely skittish. And some of our engineers were as well, honestly. Actually, one of my big internal alignment stories was discovering that not everybody really understood that was the vision of the game, right? And making sure that literally, okay, you guys, I need you all on board about this, or it's going to fail.
That's the whole thing. Yeah.
Isn't that completely antithesis, though, to exactly what you were saying, though, about ownership? Because you're saying you can go in and the game can dictate ownership and rewrite property. That's like a fundamental.
The game doesn't dictate ownership. Your skill dictates ownership.
You're
okay,
opting
good.
into the game in which you can get robbed.
Yes. And that's the property rights story that's so interesting to me. Is like, this is the business question. Do players crave an opportunity to go into a space like that? And I think the answer is there is some desire there, but oh my goodness, the expectation value calculation is difficult, especially if it's a lot of people on the map at the same time. If you're expecting that 90% of the time I walk in the map, I get murdered, that's a difficult probability to weigh against about why you would choose to carry something into that map. And I had some solutions to that. I think that you can do a lot with quality of life stories. It's tough when the thing is just power. I think that would be a really interesting game to run is, you have a high probability of losing, but you spent money on a gun that is more powerful. I would love to explore that. Our players hated that idea. Our founders hated that idea. So I was like, okay, set that aside. I think that would be a thing worth exploring if you were just upfront about it from the beginning.
The game can still take a property right, though. Like, I have something in my backpack and you can take it without my permission. Or I guess
give your permission when you entered the map.
See, this I think gets you into sketchy territory, because this goes back to like how you can justify homeowners associations. This is how you justify it like cuts at the very idea of ownership. But you're giving up some of your rights in a mutual association for mutual benefit. And we could say the same thing for like Steam licenses that Chris was saying. I think it cuts back to the thesis, though, if this is how
I'll touch on that. Right.
I know I'm poking a little bit of fun at this. I think there are answers.
I know
to this,
it's good.
But I think
it's good. It's good. But like personally, I lean dangerously close to being almost just contractarian on this. Like on some level, I feel if it's not a particularly abusive situation and people are generally pretty well informed, almost any contract is okay. And so I don't have a strong moral opposition to the life model in video games. I know a lot of people in the Web3 space do. I don't share that moral outrage for that. I think it's okay to have a library membership card instead of going to a bookstore. I do think that there is a strong demand for ownership. And I think that it is a thing that we can supply in the market. And I'm very interested to see if true ownership in some sense wins out over the library card model. And I think that it could. I think that it probably would. That having been said, for all of the reasons that we're saying, gave us a lot of feedback. And this is one of the advantages of Midnight Society's development model, which is super rare and I wouldn't recommend it for everybody, but I loved it, is like just being super open. In pre-alpha, we had a lot of people playing the game. And we were on Discord and we let them stream the game when it was like block out. There weren't even textures on anything, right?
We're exactly the same way at Star Atlas. Like the players are playing stuff and it makes it difficult, but it helps to drive our development.
Yes.
Okay, which feature, especially on chain.
Absolutely. And nothing wins over an internal business team like hearing your players say, I love this, but that sucks.
We can literally, there are sometimes when we're in the middle of a difficult decision, I just go to the community and I'm like, guys, can you just post a survey in the Discord?
Yes.
I just am curious. And then we get like a 90-10 split.
Yes.
And it's, oh, that was easy.
Exactly.
Yeah, so I really love this conversation. I want to bring up the obvious. I see it's already on the list here. So extraction shooter game, the hotness of the last couple of weeks has been the I'm so bad with names. What's that new game that everybody's
Dude, I'm so
grid
Off the Grid.
Off the Grid. It's a huge success, blah blah blah. We saw not Mr. Beast, Mr. Mustache guy who wears the
Dr. Disrespect.
Dr. Disrespect and Crypto Stash, but Dr. Disrespect is playing. It's got like millions of people watching it. Seems like that initial marketing push which probably ran them a couple $10 million or so, maybe even more. It's fizzled out. Not a lot of people necessarily streaming it anymore. Still a lot of transactions going through, still presumably a lot of players. Really interesting project, but as far as I'm concerned, not a lot of it is on chain, right? Like you're not literally dropping that NFT and somebody's picking up in game and it's being associated with their wallet. As far as I can tell.
Yeah.
But that's mostly because I do on-chain analytics. So if I can't find an on-chain program, I assume it's not on-chain.
Yeah, and that was so. Just to connect these two, right? Like that was ultimately the pivot we ended up making, was to not have in-game actions translate directly to being on-chain property right transfers. Like, and I'm sad about that personally. I really wanted to pursue that, but yeah, that's what players decided. And let's take a moment and discuss like some of the reasons why, because I think it's worth it, because it wasn't necessarily what I was the most concerned about. To props to my engineering team, one of the biggest things that they called out was like the impossibility of actually getting cheating down to a level that like makes people feel like that was actually a fair transaction, right? It's tough. And you look at how much cheating is going on, even just in Tarkov, which doesn't have the on-chain like property transfer either. And yet there's like whole videos about the wiggle, right? Like we're like there's so many cheaters that they'll like wiggle to each other through walls to identify who's a cheater, because then that's like a community of cheaters, right? Okay.
And
now
they have this problem
incentivize
in off the
what's
grid.
that?
They have this problem in off the grid. Like it's one of the biggest criticisms
And
is that there's cheaters.
exactly. And now incentivize those cheaters and make it so that you have a specific profit incentive to be cheating, not just to be griefing people, right? Tough. And so you're signing up for an arms race, and that is a very difficult arms race to win. Like part of the costing for that business model was like, yeah, you can get things in game, but here's like the number of headcount we need to hire this like team, this like Secret Service team who's like going to be monitoring literally every possible piece of telemetry.
We set this up at Amazon Games. We did it for all the MMOs. We needed to for this exact reason. We needed an anti-fraud, anti-cheat, because as soon as there's tradability, that means whether or not there's cash in the game or not, people are there's financial incentive, because you can just go off platform and trade things and then do it and execute the trade in game. I totally hear
exactly right.
So did you just use AI or something to catch these guys, or did you literally have an army of QA people who were just there to make sure there weren't cheaters? Were you successful?
Oh yeah, we did massive ban waves. So if you go to Lost Ark right now and you look at Lost Ark's PSU curve on Steam, you'll see these huge drops. And these huge drops are when we did ban waves. So there are things trading bots, sometimes bots in of themselves, gold farmers, hard currency farmers.
What's wrong with a trading bot?
It's not necessarily...
They're just making the market more efficient.
It's not necessarily the trading bot. So there's an economic problem where if you do have a bot, they're basically farming resources really rapidly. And so they're pushing prices down to zero. That's the problem.
That's farm bot. What about the trade bot?
I misspoke. I didn't mean like just simply a player that's programmed to execute a trade. Sometimes they're just trying to keep market prices stable, ironically enough. Like they're just trained to buy. So no, we didn't ban that. That's what I meant. Maybe farming bots is more appropriate. They're just usually always involved in trades.
And I've thought a lot about this, having worked in Web3, and I've identified like two different types of problems with respect to bots. One is a skill type of bot that's in a problem for games like Off the Grid and like in Jason's case. And then there's like the economic bots who are duplicating behavior that's causing prices to drop to zero. I think there's a pretty easy solution to this one. I think that the skill-based one is actually like the bigger problem, and it poses a significant hurdle. You can imagine the most extreme kind of play-to-earn game would be like chess, but with stakes. But chess is the easiest game in the world to cheat at, ironically.
Yes.
So
Chess.com struggles with that like ferociously.
And there's no financial incentives there. And yet they have 35% of their population or their users are I think the official number is like 8% or something, but I think that's bullshit. But
it's salty after that last loss. That was cheating.
So you guys pivoted away from that and to what?
Essentially, the idea was that there would still be items, they would still be NFTs, you would still buy them, but what you're buying essentially, it was painful because it's such a departure from the property species thing. But what you're buying is like a customization thing, like a customization factory, like a bot. It's like a 3D printer, but it's going to it's very specifically pay like only that one weapon, and it's going to do it the same way every time. So you have to find the assault rifle on the map, and then when you get it back to your hideout, now you can like paint on its thing.
Cosmetics economy.
So it's a cosmetics economy. It's just exactly. Economy. And so you could trade that out to somebody else. And what we were to preserve. So one of the other NFT like excitements, in my opinion, is, you have some like big moment. You have a streamer or you have a competition or just like something. And then you have this like emergent moment where something cool happened and I won the game. And here's the video clip. And it was with this sniper rifle. And it was like this 360 no scope like headshot. And oh my gosh, it's so beautiful. And the player signed it. And here's their like name on it, which will be like marked upon it now forever. And that now is a item with history, and whoever owns that item has all of that item history. And some of that is in like an auction house. You can have that player like literally auction off that weapon, and cool, like that would be super fun. You could even have some that never had a financial transaction on it, but still it's wow, people have all owned this. Well, I follow these 3 streamers and all 3 of them had it. Or I loved this weapon so much, I'm on a quest to get it back and I'm going to push. Hey, play this game on this day, bring in this weapon and I'll bring in whatever else you want me to bring in, but you got to give me a chance to get my thing back, right? There's so many cool stories that are built into that at the weapon level. Could we do that with that kind of a cosmetic only story? Yeah, but it wasn't lost. But I can stamp and say we're using that cosmetic at the time in that moment, and then the trader. It's such a weaker story. It's still there. It's
CS:GO does do this. CS:GO has this exact thing you're talking about, or the signed weapons, the tradability. So does it go back to the point you're making earlier that because the blockchain has this decentralized trustless, verifiable scarcity, that ultimately is what will separate it from everything else. And that notion is really powerful. And that's why the Steam Marketplace is not a viable substitute for blockchain stuff.
Yeah, that's basically it. I think
Okay.
that given that we no longer have what I would consider really the most natural evolved biological story of property. So since we have stumbled away from this precious thing and are doing this status-like model, yeah, I think that is still a differentiator. The other major differentiator is where can you trade that thing? Because if you're engaged with the CSGO, there's only one place to trade it. They make it a pain in the ass to try to cash out. People have figured out ways of doing so, but it's sketchy and you're going against the terms of service. So it still doesn't really feel like ownership in that space for most people most of the time, I think. And I do think that's a stronger story. Also, maybe there will be other people who generate, I don't know, some other Web3 platform that specializes in game usable items in a way that like spins up commodity markets in that space that gain other like efficiencies or breadth of knowledge. And then all of a sudden you're like, wow, that gun looks amazing. Which game is it for? Oh, that's cool. I'll go play it in that game. That's interesting. I think that there's like a number of different aspects there.
Can I ask another question about extraction shooter economy design? Dead Drop was an extraction shooter like Tarkov or Dark and Darker. I played a bunch of Dark and Darker, and what struck me is that the economy is extremely inflationary. You're like, for the most part, you go in, you get a bunch of resources, and over the season, people hire more resources, more power level, and they handle this with seasonal reset, right? It's like very similar to Diablo or Path of Exile. And that hard reset works great in those games, but when the players have this expectation that, I don't know, their items will be permanently tradable or hold value, like how do you do this reset hyperinflation cycle? Or do you have a different sort of cycle?
No, I agree with you. You're exactly right. That's a major challenge. And there's a couple of different directions that you can go with it. In our case, since after the pivot, I think the simplest answer is you build in the resets into the game. And so you need to have a progression system that's growing, but the progression system doesn't have to be the item. It could be some other thing. It could be like skill with a weapon. It could be like other unlocks. It could be like other aspects of customization, for example, maybe in your hideout or other places. But like, you're right. You have to fight the hyperinflationary aspect somehow or another, and it gets really tough. I think I'm actually not 100% sure what the final state on Dead Drop is going to be. I know that was one of the things that was like in discussion is how do we handle this hyperinflationary problem? But I think that's a totally viable solution, is to make it so that people are excited about day one of the next season, right? Give them the hyperinflationary environment, resist the hyperinflation. When it is unresistible anymore, let it saturate like you're a Bolshevik. And then when everybody's like, oh, the hyperinflation sucks, and you're like, and then you're excited, I'm going to take it all away. It's a bit of a dance, right? But so long as there is some other aspect of progression that's maintaining, it's a little bit like, it was a game, Zagreus is the main character. Hades. Like that sense of every time you're playing a game, you're not really starting from zero. Like you lost everything, but you're building a little bit. So I think you need some sort of not reset progression story. But the stuff itself, the stuff you're using in the game doesn't necessarily have to be the permanent thing. Another option would be to allow it to be it degrades over time, or it has like fixed number of uses or something like that. Like you have a durability story, but most people
have you heard about my staircase tax?
Yeah, I think I remember hearing you talk about your staircase. Yeah, I think that the durability is generally hated though. It's really difficult to make durability that players are excited about. And it also takes you out of immersion a little bit too. Most gun owners do not feel like, oh, you press assault rifle 20 times, time to throw it away and get a new one. It just doesn't sit.
So I think I have a pretty controversial take here. I think it's okay you look at my house. I've got more stuff every single month. I buy something else. Some of it I consume, like food and fuel, and maybe even some things degrade over time. If I play one of these board games 1,000 times, it's going to be just a bunch of fluffy cardboard left over. That said, I don't think accumulation is necessarily a bad thing. Now, obviously, if we're talking about hyperinflation, okay, that's fine. It's like, we don't want that. But I'm generally okay with the fact that players might have this arsenal of items. It happens in Fortnite, and obviously it's a completely different economy, but I have spent very little money in Fortnite. I still have dozens and dozens of skins.
But
some people have thousands.
But in an extraction shooter, like it's gameplay affecting. So there's also like these wealth inequality effects of, okay, if you're top skilled, you can't do matchmaking very well. That means there's gonna be a 1% that has all the awesome weapons, and the other people are gonna fucking suck. There's all these really interesting dynamics. And I'm sure you've been thinking about that too. You've been thinking about it for a religious amount of time.
I've been thinking about it a lot. One of my hopes was that we would have such a large player base that we could do matchmaking not on skill, but on loadout. There's the two factors on that would have actually potentially solved my other problem also, which is addressing the expectation value calculation of an item that you have purchased, well, you're going in with like approximately $50 in your loadout according to the current market prices. We're going to try to matchmake you with other people who are approximately $50. It's never going to be perfect, but that's the
It's like European. So it's like you go up the league system, and
Yeah.
when you're in Premier League, everyone's gonna have a certain club value versus being in a lower league. I don't know. I'm spending too much time in Europe.
Exactly. And so I think that there's a similar story that you can do with the power side of items as well. But now you've got like a 2-dimensional face space that you're trying to matchmake in, and crazy how quickly matchmaking times jump up.
Okay, how many people can be? 32 players. Okay,
Exactly.
now we're going to drop the skill parameter. Now it's just going to be wealth.
God.
Fuck, that could be an awful experience for some people.
People game the wealth score as well. Dark and Darker did this just under the cusp, right?
Oh. And now you think about marketplace dynamics, right? Because you can buy yourself into a matchmaking slot almost. That's interesting.
Got a selection of good things on sale, stranger.
We have a special guest, Jason.
Sure.
We'll focus on you today. What have you been playing these days?
I have only been playing Black Myth Wukong. That game has absolutely sucked me in a degree. I love it. I'm a huge fan. I love the pace of progression in that game. I generally don't like Dark Souls types games. They're just a little bit too, not quite that much of a masochist, I think is the basic. Playing a game that it beats you up, but you do learn the patterns on the bosses and can eventually make it through. Greatly satisfying. Like the sense of satisfaction that I have gotten from beating that game is greater than the satisfaction I've gotten from almost any other game in a very long time. Like they really nailed the difficulty curve, at least for me personally. And you can overlevel a little bit, but you still have to memorize the boss moves. Like they will still crunch you even when you're like pretty tough. I have really been enjoying it. It's been reminding me of the fact that single player games are actually one of my favorite things. I love stories. I think that as a genre, I'm sorry, not as a genre, as a medium, video games are almost unique at being able to convey certain kinds of stories because you feel so present in the story in a way that you just don't in books and movies. It's just extraordinary. And I like the Journey to the West anyway. I'd read that kind of bridged version before, but like Monkey King has always been a fascinating character. He just nail it. He's just like the environment, like the vibe, the dialogue, like the characters. It's just outstanding. I'm a huge fan. Makes me wonder about single player games though.
So that was actually the most convincing argument I've heard for storytelling in single player games, is that by having this omnidirectional relationship, there's a sense of presence that you literally can't get with anything else. Because I always used to shit on storytelling in games, because at the end of the day, we're telling most of our story with cutscenes, which by definition is you're taking away what makes games, which is the omnidirectional piece. It becomes, or excuse me, games are the bidirectional piece that becomes omnidirectional. Okay, that just means we suck if we're going back to these methods. But that is a really fucking convincing argument.
In my opinion, communicate while you're playing. They're telling you the story as you're. That's what I love about Dark Souls types of games. While I'm talking Sekiro, you should try Sekiro out. Similar kind of vibes as Wukong. And then once you get through that, then you just go to Dark Souls and you're fully converted.
I'll be converted. Yeah, I like that Wukong does a good job on this. I think that tell the story in multifacets. Part of it is just in the game. Part of it's while you're walking around. Part of it's listening in to the bad guys as they're talking to each other before you like storm their camp. A lot of it's just in the environment and just like seeing what happened to the temple after it was burned or whatever the moment is, right? It's multifaceted. But I will say in a cutscene where I have been playing as this character and like struggling as this character and feeling like my heart race when I accidentally fall down and take falling damage. I'm like, oh! Like I get that because I'm so embedded in the character. In that moment, the cutscene still feels like me. It still feels like a reward of what I'm doing, so long as the character does something that I might plausibly do. Like it can throw me out if they immediately do something like counter to the character in some way. But my experience of a cutscene is not the same as my experience watching a TV show. Another example of that, one of my other favorite first-player games ever was Nier Automata. Oh my God, I love that game. I couldn't really get through the anime. Something about 2B and 9S, like walking around, talking and doing these other things. Like it was very well done. It's beautiful, but I wasn't present. I wasn't there. I wasn't in the show, but the cutscenes in the game, I did feel like I was in the show. So again, I think that there's a difference there as a narrative experience.
This is fascinating to me because you studied physics, you go on to do economics, experimental economics. You also work in supply chain management. And you like narrative-based games? What is wrong with this fucking crew?
What's so unusual about any of that?
You get a pass for fighting, I think, but we should be focusing on RPG, like spreadsheets. We should think on live service, mechanics, systems, institutions. Like,
Well, it's the
have
main
that.
problem
Just
that
because you
we
like
don't.
math doesn't mean you don't like stories. What do you mean?
That's right. And it has magic in it,
just-
which is a binding force of X
That's
I learned in a
true.
previous episode.
That's true.
I think Phil's main problem with these types of games is they're much harder to monetize in any way that's not boxed like a
That's
like-
true, but I guess what I find powerful about games is mechanics. It's so much fun to think about mechanics, right? That to me is the drug, is the systems, right? The systems that we can create. The bidirectional systems are so interesting. Streaks, power up score streaks. Those things
But
are
there
really
are
interesting.
systems in single player games. I am seriously
fair.
like I am a hair's breadth. I have seriously thought about going onto Reddit, finding somebody who has done some of the damage data and like doing the partial differential calculus on whether I'm better off increasing my defense score or increasing my damage reduction, because what's the difference between these, right? I can nerd out on the mechanics in a single player game like this as well.
Yeah, fair.
Yeah.
Yeah, what's
I guess
But I
like,
want the institution to survive for a really long time, right? There's the section of economics, which is, or even political economy, which is about the Constitution, right? Like, how do you make the best Constitution, the one that survives the longest? Okay, we'll make an amendment process that does this, or we'll make it so you can't amend this. So there's all this work we've spent into building constitutions, and I think about games in the same way. Like, we're trying to build these constitutions that can persist for a really long time. That's why we were talking about like the best game economy of all time, Match. That's why I think Match is the greatest design, because it's an institution that is infinitely refreshable. Like, it's very clear what you need to do to win on that. The institution is designed, the mechanics are clear. You just plug in content and go. It's easy. It's like a spin-off show. I already got the IP, I already got everything. I just plug it into the system. That's the whole thing. It falls short for me on single player games.
Feel this way about your other media consumption? There's an optimal TV show, and I just want The Simpsons to run for 5,000 seasons. And
I want progression. Like, I love talking about serialized versus procedural television. That's been a major shift over the last couple of years. Very similar to live service conversation we're having. Like, you can have persistence. You can have references to the back show. People can go back and listen to it. Like, you could definitely tell a story about, I would say, linear media coming around, I would argue, to us. Even if you look at like Dan Harmon, if you're familiar with him, he's like the creator of Community. He writes in game loops. He writes specifically in loops, in progression loops. He has these things called circles on his website, where he talks about a character going through a crisis and going through a character arc in that, just like you would in a game, like trying to solve a problem, and then you walk away with some permanent progression. That's the last part of a circle. Everyone has to walk away with something that they take to the future.
Oh, don't credit that to him. That's like Joseph Campbell's like
But see, I also watch like a fuck ton of rom-coms, but it's because I want to study the mechanics. Like, girl falls over in front of her love interests, laughs. Like, that to me is a mechanic. I thought we'd be united on this as economists.
Well, so
like the institutions.
Well, so what's your thesis?
I want to give
like,
Jason.
Phil, is your thesis?
Yeah, please.
I agree. Let me just. I don't disagree with you. I think that these mechanics are really great, and I think that one of the things that kills a perpetual live service is when they fail on those mechanics and just think a new season of new flashy items is all that I need, but there isn't that sense of progression. There isn't that sense of danger. Nobody's changed. Nothing's advanced in the narrative. But I don't think I am very happy to accept that video games can do either of these things and don't necessarily have to do both. Personally, would like to have one or two, I don't know, lifestyle games, you might say. I'm logging in with my buddies every Wednesday and we're going to do like a raid, and it's social and it's like an ongoing experience. And I don't want that to change very much. Like, I want to have a sense of mastery over that and have an ongoing steady account progression. On the side, I also want to watch or play through a bunch of like self-contained stories where I feel like I'm connecting with something deeply human, or like expanding my thought process in some kind of crazy way. But I don't want to have a whole bunch of lifestyle games that I'm playing. And I don't want to only be doing single player games, because then I'm missing out on that like social aspect and missing out on like the long-term art. And so I think that we do definitely want both of those things to exist. But like, one of the great moments, in my opinion, for a single player game is when you've done all of the things and you put it down and you're like, oh my God, I loved that. Like, I haven't picked Cyberpunk up back again after I did the third like playthrough of the third class type, even though I'm an like IRL corpo. Like, I wanted to experience the hell out of every part of that game, and I loved it. Oh my God, the city was a character in Cyberpunk. Like, God, it pulled me in. Similarly with Wukong, I just finished the New Game Plus first time, but I'm going to do like the full 3 loops and get all the stuff and make sure I've got unlocked every spirit, and I'm going to put it down. And I'm going to be very happy with my experience, and will definitely buy the next game that they come out with. It doesn't need to be like the permanent game. I close the book, I put the book back on the shelf, and I admire it from time to time.
See, that's a very healthy
And
relationship.
Phil doesn't like that because he wants to be.
It's about addiction. It's caffeine. It's your coffee. I don't want to put.
Well, it sounds like, Phil, you see a game being a composition of a bunch of mechanics, a bunch of little building blocks that create the whole game. And what you like about live service is that you can always add a new block and charge for every single block, versus a single player game that's typically sold as one giant collection of these blocks for a single price. Because I think we're all on the same page. I don't know what your thesis is, Phil, and why you get so upset when we talk about single player.
One of the things I've been thinking about is like recasting part of what we do into the cake eating problem that we all had to solve in grad school, like that dynamic optimization problem of, okay, I have a piece of cake and I need to figure out the optimal way to eat the cake that maximizes my utility. So like on one hand, you could just stuff the cake in your face. That's one thing you could do, but you might hit diminishing returns really quickly. I could have a bite every 15 seconds. I could have a bite every 30 minutes. I could have a bite every 15 minutes. Then I could have 30 minutes. Then I go back 15 minutes. So we're trying to solve that really fun intertemporal problem. And I think part of what you do in systems design is you solve that in some way. You're trying to figure out how to ration the content to players on what schedule maximizes net present lifetime utility of the game. What is that feeding schedule for content? And when you have a game, because when you have a single player game, it's finite, right? And that I think makes it a particular set of problems. But when it's infinite, like Candy Crush, for instance, it's almost how often do you it's not just, okay, there's a set amount of oil in the ground. We need to figure out the optimal pace to get the oil out of the ground. It's, oh, we can invent fracking and we can find new oil deposits. And that's what I think you get in live service that makes the problem really interesting, in addition to the cake eating problem that you get in single player.
I still think that while I think each game has its own unique, not indifferent set, but its own unique utility. And I can play these live service games up until a point. I get bored of them the same way I get bored of a single player game. I have played Dark Souls for well over 1,000 hours, even though it's a single game. I've just beaten it many times. And I've played Fortnite probably for, 220 hours, which presumably Fortnite should have gotten much more playtime. But I have a completely different utility function for these two different games. And I don't think you can, this is probably more philosophical, but I don't think you can change the shape of it.
Fair enough.
I have a question for you guys. We're on the single player talk fit now, so I really want to hear your forecast predictions about single player games, though, going into the future. Because I remember there was a time a decade ago when everybody was like, there's just not going to be any single player games. The economics don't make any sense. Everything's going to be live service. It's interesting to me that we've had a bunch of very successful single player titles come out in the last few years that have been beloved. I do wonder, is there a comparative advantage for them coming from abroad? Like, it seems that the biggest ones, at least in my own bias, to my own availability bias, there's an import advantage there, right? Stellar Blade, right? Those have been the peak titles.
Say import, you mean like foreign to the US? Okay, so they everything from Japan, right? Elden Ring. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
What are the big ones from the US? Phil, you mentioned a couple, but
I was thinking Spider-Man, Last of Us, God of War were the ones that kind of came to mind.
Sony
I think you could put Half-Life in
I was
there.
gonna say, don't those all come out of Santa Monica?
That is true. This one very specific pier in Santa Monica. There used to be like Max Payne. If you remember that old franchise.
Yeah, I love
Hitman
I looked
is
up the
Europe.
top selling box games, and it was like all EA Sports and like COD.
Oh yeah, of course.
But the question really is like, why? Is it just an issue of? And actually, when I said import, I didn't really mean US. That's not actually quite right. I really meant because Cyberpunk. Yeah, I don't know.
Small games industry sectors, like you're talking about
like
Poland,
smaller,
China.
Yeah, it's like smaller game industries, and I'm wondering if the comparative advantage in this case is wage, where it's prohibitively expensive to make a single player title in the West at this point, or is it something else? Am I like just looking at the simplest input cost inappropriately, and it's actually culture? It's actually like some other barrier to entry or something like that. I don't know, but I'm really curious about that.
I'll throw one theory out. It's less that the single player games are worse in the West, but that the single player US has a particular advantage in live service games because bigger companies, more established industries, larger marketing budgets, right? So they can make these much larger shots. And because these live service games require critical mass and a really professionalized, productionalized content pipeline, right? So, and as a result, the fledgling industries in Poland have to go for the niche where it's like smaller bet size, lower risk.
It's still a comparative advantage story though, right?
It
like
is.
We're good at this, they're good at that, relatively speaking.
But you think it's like the network effects and economies of scope are like what are driving that difference more than you think just merely the wage as an input cost?
But don't we have to tell a change? We have to tell a change story, right? We can't just tell a level story. What's changed that would change
The industry in
relative
established
wages.
US has got bigger and bigger, more larger companies, larger conglomerates, whereas, and it's starting to crop up with these like grassroots developers in Poland. Where is Baldur's Gate made? It's like Netherlands or something?
I thought it was.
No, it's not Poland. The interesting thing about Poland is actually it's been one of the fastest economically growing countries in Europe.
Right. It's on a
I'm not sure where that technological growth is coming from. I would be surprised if it's coming from tech, though it's not possible. It's not impossible. Their economy used to be coal, and now it's not coal. So it's got to be something. I'm curious if we were to look at that. Because I guess if there were to be, I assume that it's our accumulation of capital, in particular processing power and storage facilities, like for cloud computing and stuff like this. That's probably where our that's where our, I guess what you were saying, like change, right? That's where the dynamic is coming, where all of a sudden we've specialized in that. I don't think Japan is like, or South Korea has stopped producing games at the same rate that they were producing.
That's true.
before.
This
They're
Nintendo
largely
generation
producing
has
the
a
same
lot
stuff. They
of
have
great single player games, and those are all still produced in Japan. So.
And I would argue, though, that I think this is a largely empirical question, and I haven't seen a lot of good data on the growth or decline of single player games as a share of the industry. I think we can intuit that it's significantly declined, though. And the reason I would argue that is because there's no single player games on mobile, and mobile is half the industry, and mobile is an increasing share of the industry. And I think it's reached equilibrium now at 50-50. But that instantly
Candy
puts
Crush a multiplayer game?
Let's hand it to our panelist, Jason. What do you think? Is Candy Crush a single player game? Do you think that's is this along the lines of the questions you were thinking about? Because normally we think I think more scripted stuff. Because I think
it's not what I had in mind. It's interesting though.
I think to tell the story you want to tell about this, right, is that costs. Again, we have to tell a change explanation, and I'm not quite sure why single player games would become increasingly unprofitable. Is the story I haven't been able to tell to myself. I
Competition, substitution. There's a new entrant.
If what you're saying on the capital accumulation side, right, exactly, but you're substituting also just at the which games are going to get made. Well, we want to make, at some level, some investors are going to say, some investors are like, I got like a pet project, let's go make some cool indie thing. But for a lot of people, if they want that return on investment, and they think that since we've got the comparative advantage here, since we've got the capital accumulation, and we can do the big multiplayer game, like that's going to get us the billions, whereas the single player game, we would only expect hundreds of millions or something like that.
I think
so
I like that story. Like at the margin, like ultimately, like when you buy a single player game, if you're a publisher, you're buying a fixed stream of income. Like it's pretty clear that the tail is going to extinguish. Whereas if I'm buying a live service game, I'm buying a stream of dividends. And not only that, the stream of that model, that preference has become more viable. Distribution, all those things. Okay, I think you could win at the margin, but I would argue it's more about live service than it is anything about single player. I don't think single players changed only at the margin in response to live service might be one other way to think about it.
Point.
That makes sense.
Yeah. And also once you've got the accumulation, you got the mature industry, your time horizon profit is going to change for a big company, willing to accept, to be patient and have the long chain of annuities.
There was
We need more games like Turmeric.
Oh my God.
Tunic.
We
really do. Simple, effective. They're not expensive to build. They deliver an exciting experience that lasts
that was Astrobot.
30 hours.
That was Astrobot. Like a lot of people are
Astrobot
seriously
is
calling
fun.
for it. Yeah, a lot of people are seriously calling for that.
Astrobot is fun. That's a good one to play with the kid, by the way. My daughter really enjoys Astrobot.
Have you ever tried Unravel?
Yes. Oh my God. We love both of them. For the first one, we played like handoff and some of the tougher puzzles I would do. But we played through the entire game in the 2-player game. That was a masterful class. It was like the challenges were tough, but accessible enough. I think she was 6 when we were doing Unravel 2. And it was like, she would request it every day. Like, let's go play more Unravel. And she would grief me like crazy. I'd go to jump. She'd pull on the rope. I'd fall down. She'd like, it was hilarious. It was such a good game. Yeah, we really liked that one.
You can really help your partner out, to your point. That makes it so accessible because you have to assume their skill is like 0 and the other player can almost do all of it. And I mean that in a good way.
Although she got really good. Like we got to the point where we were both just like Spider-Maning through the tough sections. It was fine.
I feel like a Little Big Planet game would be rough.
They had that.
Like,
they had
I
Little
don't remember
Sackboy.
when the last
They had a
time
Sackboy adventure game. Yeah.
Oh, really? What's it called?
Sackboy Adventures, something like that.
I missed that one.
Sackboy: A Big Adventure.
Oh.
I did not know that. When did that come
It
out?
was a couple of years ago.
I just
It is
bought
okay.
Unravel 2 because of your promotion.
Let me know what you think about it.
It
The
is
other
true.
one, what was the other one? It's a 2-player only experience.
Oh, It Takes
It Takes Two. Yeah.
Yeah.
It Takes Two is also really good. There's one specific scene that she had to leave the room for. a stuffed animal, like a stuffed elephant. And
It was
was
pretty
like,
serious themes. It was like parents going through divorce.
it's true, which was great though, as like a context to talk about this stuff, because it turned out that's something that like she had fears about. And so being able to talk about it and address it was like really like an emotional experience for me as a father to be like, it's okay, honey, but thank you for sharing your fears about this. Let's talk about it. We're ice skating together on this like crazy explosive like platform.
This is what I think Brian Kaplan missed in his selfish reasons to have more kids, is a co-op partner. I think that's the missing link. I know Eric gets to have this too. He's been raising.
Yeah, we've been playing over together. She loves it.
No,
She's
dude,
really
that's not
it.
the game to choose.
Dude,
That's a
she wanted-
divorce
All about
game.
coordinating,
I was like, hey, you want to play Zelda? And she's like,
communication.
no, let's play Overcooked. I want to make some mushroom soup. And I'm like, all right.
I like the first 5 levels of Overcooked, and after that, it gets way too crazy. I just want to put like the tomato in the pot, cook the pot, done.
The other two that she requests for me are 9 Parchments, play on Switch. Mario
Of course, an oldie but a goodie.
and oldie but a good.
There's also Army of Two when she's older.
When she's
Shoot.
older. I'm going to hold
Maybe
on
an
that one.
alternative.
There's another one called Two Brothers. That's a 2-player game,
Yeah.
a 2-player coordination game.
Yeah, that looked great too. It's similar. I haven't played it yet, but it also looked like it had a lot of potential.
Shoot a DM, find him on LinkedIn.
Well, he's
link out
available
your
to the
LinkedIn.
late.
Available to the ladies, available to
Lady
the
employers.
employer.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
I got
Thank-
my Monopoly monopsony contract is firm still for the marriage front.
Dude,
We should teach this to our children. Economics is major. Everyone has to major in economics. Number 1, for personal survival. Economics is major.